So we're really happy to be here at Firebox. My name's Hilary Wainwright. I'm one of 5 editors of Red Pepper. In a way, Red Pepper, like Firebox, like Pluto, are all part of a kind of growing infrastructure of what is a growing left and a growing movement. So we're really happy to be here. This is like the first of many discussions that we'll be having in Firebox every month, and we'll tell you about the next one next month. But basically, Red Pepper is a kind of, I hope, a space for kind of strategic reflection and exchange of ideas. It's not connected to any one political party or political organisation. That doesn't mean it's sort of flabby and hopeless and lacking in a sense of direction. Its direction is to build a non-sectarian principled and grassroots left that's really giving a voice to the struggles which are on the ground but don't get any kind of voice or expression, and we need strategic thinking or a space for them to engage in strategic thinking. And in a sense, that's what makes me so happy about launching John's book, because John is somebody who really unites theory and practice. You know, he is a strategic person, somebody who's been involved in the global justice movement for the last 20 years in many different capacities, as a sort of grassroots activist, and now as director of War on Want, which is a very significant organisation which can't really be dismissed as an NGO. You know, it is a political movement, a political organisation, and this is a highly political and strategic book. It's a book which starts from the gross injustice of contemporary capitalism, but then it then goes on to actually analyse who the enemy is, who the kind of real sources of power behind capitalism today are, and particularly the multinational, the transnationals. But then it goes on to actually explore their strategies, how they exert their power, the forms of domination that they exert, and how they have reacted to the social justice movement, how they have attempted to protect themselves and diffuse and demoralise the global and divide the global justice movement. I think it's a key aspect of its strategic quality is its internationalism, the fact that it's given not just voice but kind of analytic space to the struggles of the global south that are frequently marginalised in many of the discussions of the left here in the north and here in the UK. And in a sense, I feel that this is something to expand on in discussion, is that it's particularly honest and challenging about the divisions between the interests, or at least apparent interests, day-to-day experience of those in the north and those in the south. So there's no easy answers in this book. It ends up with a very inspiring chapter on alternatives, in a way that's drawing particularly from Latin American experiences, but in a way which is treating those experiences as experiments from which we can learn the lessons of failure as well as the lessons of success. So I won't say anything more myself, but just to sort of whet your appetites for what I think will be a really important political discussion. To get this off to a really good start, we're having 2 of the most strategically minded intellectuals of the left. Firstly, Doreen Massey, who's been a bit in the wars. She is a street fighting woman, but it's not been because of that she's broken a finger and mashed the hip. So she's come almost straight from A&E, and so she's a bit shaky. But it's one really amazing that you can come, Doreen.
Thank you.
So, you know. And then Francisco Dominguez, who's the chair of the Venezuela Solidarity Committee, who's one of the many Chilean exiles who really, in my experience at any rate, enriched the left politically, particularly in London, but also in Manchester and several other areas. So we're really pleased to have him. He's also chair of the, or organizer, director of the Center for Brazilian and Latin American Studies at Middlesex University. So again, he's another person that, I think it's this word praxis, combines theory and practice. So our plan is for John to speak for about 10 minutes, and he says I must gently nudge him when he gets to that limit. and then Doreen will comment, open up the discussion, and then Francesco, and then it'll be open to you. But I'll bring Francesco and Doreen in, at certain moments as well. So, anyway, so over to John.
The book itself, the title of The Poverty of Capitalism, is designed really to situate all of the things that War on Want works on, all of the injustices around the world, all of the poverties and all of the struggles, to situate that very firmly within the struggle against capitalism and the globalized capitalist economy. And if you think back 10 years ago, perhaps everybody at that time was speaking much more around globalization and corporate power. And I think that what we've learned as a result of the crisis, the massive crisis which swept around the global economy from 2008 onwards, is that it's actually the heart of capitalism that is the problem. This idea that you have a system set up for the benefit of the few and based on the impoverishment of the many. And that, I suppose, is the central point of the book, that it tries to bring that out through examples, through analysis, and through a proper understanding of how that power, how the power of capital has been so immeasurably developed over the last 40 years. And I suppose the starting point really is that we've just come through this massive crisis, 2008, 2009. And yet, even by 2010, really in just a trice, you have the whole system being remade in exactly the same form, as if we learnt nothing at all from the crisis and all of the chaos that it caused. And it's like as if you've had a terrible heart attack and you've just been under the most appalling surgery, you've just come out of A&E, and the doctor says to you, there's no need to change anything in your previous life, don't exercise too much, keep up with the smoking, and see if you can up your intake of fatty foods. I mean, it's got that sense of you've learned nothing at all, just go back to exactly where you were and see if we can avoid the same problem. So what you saw was the G20, the group of the 20 largest economies in the world, in 2010 saying, right, now we had a little bit of stimulus to restart the circulation of capital, but now we need to have austerity. We need to turn on the peoples of the world, the people of Europe and North America, just as we in the past turned on the peoples of the South. We're going to turn on them and make them pay for a crisis which they did not cause. And they start up by putting in the institutions which were there already, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and even though these institutions were directly responsible for the crash, they're the ones who've been brought back to police the global economy in the post-crisis era. And what I thought was really interesting, and this is where the book starts, is that it wasn't the old colonial centers of empire, the G8, which signed up to this program. Countries like China, India, Brazil, they step in and they affirm the institutions of discipline as the IMF and the WTO. And that's precisely because it's their national champions, their biggest firms, which are now engaging in the global economy and challenging those at the centre of corporate power. So that's really where the book starts, and it tries to unpick a little bit, as Hilary was saying, it tries to unpick a little bit where the power came from. So it looks back a little bit at the history of the trade talks from the 1980s onwards, and then the bilateral investment treaties, the bilateral trade treaties, which people know about now, the challenges being made by capital, which has been elevated to a status equivalent to that of the sovereign state. Basically now capital has the same power as sovereign countries in front of the international tribunals which dictate whether or not countries like Argentina, for example, have to pay hundreds and hundreds of millions in compensation to companies which failed in their state. But what I think is also interesting, and we start the chapter of chapter 3 with this example, it's not just in the countries of the global south. You see Germany, for example, which in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster decided it was going to terminate its nuclear power program from 2022. Vattenfall, a Swedish firm, comes in and said, well, hang on, that means that we have the potential of losing out commercially from 2022 onwards, and therefore we are now suing the German people for 3.7 billion euros, 3,700 million euros, 3.7 billion. And you think, that's extraordinary, that you've got one of the world's most powerful economies being held hostage by a company which is saying they don't like the idea that they won't be able to make as much profit in the future as they have done in the past. And that challenge to democracy, I think, is one of the things that we need to see is the most pernicious element of the spread of capitalist power. The second element, in terms of this idea of the completion of the world market, which is a phrase very familiar from the Communist Manifesto all the way back in 1848, this idea that there is an ongoing push to try to complete this market, to expand the reach of capital into every single field of every bit of our lives. And the chapter 4 is trying to see, well, one of the ways in which it's done this is through corporate social responsibility. This idea that if you can team up with capital and cajole it into doing the right thing, it will actually be the lead agency in the process of historical development. It's not about people, it's not about communities, it's not about workers, it's about giving capital its head and watching it do the right thing. And we know that that's just absolute rubbish, but I think it's a particular challenge to those of us in the NGO community, perhaps, where there's been a lot of groups who've made common cause with some of the biggest corporations, trying to hitch their wagon to theirs and see if they can benefit, see if they can sort of direct them a little bit, get a bit of you know, corporate aid, a bit of philanthropy and stuff like that, rather than challenging that power. So that's one of the elements which I think is important from the book, and we have a particular sort of desire to make that point to other NGOs in the international development sector. The next bits, there's 3 chapters where I try and treat 3 individual sectors which are very much at the centre of War on Want's work. The first is the extractives sector, so oil and gas and mining, which is very much the area where you get the most extreme forms of dispossession when capital roams around the world, and the extreme forms of struggle from communities trying to fight back and reclaim sovereignty over their natural resources. The second of those chapters is around the garments sector. Many of you will be aware of the work that War on Want has done in respect of the garment sector in Bangladesh, particularly following the Rana Plaza disaster in April of this year, when 1,100 people lost their lives as a result of the collapse of a factory which had been forced to cut corners as a result of the downwards pressure on prices from retailers in the rich north. And then the third element is the food regime, the capitalist food regime, which has spread through this extraordinary concentration of power in the handful of corporations which basically dictate the prices and the things that we eat, all the way, as they say, from farm to fork. The production, the distribution and the consumption of food. But what I think is what was most inspiring for me in doing the research on this, and also working with War on Want's partners in this respect, is that the food regime is also where you see the greatest form of resistance forming. This worldwide movement fighting for food sovereignty against the capitalist system, and very explicitly against it, saying we reject the idea that food should be a commodity which is sold for mass profit, that seeds should be controlled by a tiny number of firms, Monsanto, Syngenta and the like, and we want to reclaim that and rebuild an ecologically sound and a socially progressive food system for the future. And that idea of a positive alternative, as Hilary said, is where the book sort of tries to round up that there are thousands and thousands of alternatives being played out across the world in small and in larger formats. One of those is very much in the Latin American context, and I hope that Francisco is going to be able to speak a little bit to that, in countries like Venezuela, Bolivia and Ecuador, where you have democratic transitions away from capitalism, explicitly saying we want to create structures which will break, which will rupture with the capitalist past. And I think that's a really important idea of actually existing programs of change which can be replicated and have already had a real impact in showing other countries the ways they can go. But the final idea is actually to say there's more than that. You don't have to have these amazing state revolutions. You can also have smaller initiatives, cooperative initiatives, collective, the social economy, all of these different ideas which are being played out around the world to challenge the idea that you have to base things on the profits of a few. And that for me was again the most optimistic note on which to end it, this sense that there is already a whole plethora of alternatives being worked out in practice, and that it's really up to us to try to support them. One of the things that War on Want does is it tries to work with the social movements, the women's organisations, the trade unions, which are trying to achieve that change from the bottom up. At the same time as doing the grassroots campaigning here as well, trying to get pressure on companies, on states, to make changes in the big globalised economy. So I hope that that is where the book ends, with that message of optimism, a message of ambition as well. Because if the title of the book is The Poverty of Capitalism, it's not just because capitalism is the root cause of poverty, but the poverty of capitalism in its ambition. If all it is able to do is to keep the wheels turning by the mass impoverishment of billions of people around the world, 2.6 billion, over half of the population of the global south mired in poverty, then that is a bankrupt system, and it's one which we should be able to do better than. So that's my call in respect to the book in a nutshell. I hope that doesn't mean you're not going to buy it, because that means it's I've then rather upsold it. But thank you so much to everybody for coming, and I really look forward to the discussion from now on.
I mean, one of the reasons I have long been a supporter of, and member, I think, of War on Want, and an admirer of John and all his works, is that they've always, unlike so many agencies which could be said to be of this type, looked at causes rather than symptoms. They have always insisted on not just describing effects, not hand-wringing over how ghastly the situation is, and not just applying elastoplast. I mean, in a sense, that just keeps the thing going, necessarily as it might be on many occasions. What War on Want and what this book now that John has produced after many years of experience tells us, makes the case for, is that we have to look at the structural causes of the poverty that he's talking about. A poverty which, as he just said, has got grotesquely exacerbated over the last 4 decades of neoliberalism. And I guess if we say that we have to look at causes rather than just at symptoms, the underlying argument is that poverty isn't a matter of distribution, and it can't be solved by simply a question of, or policies of, redistribution, right? What's at issue is reorganising the structures which have produced the poverty in the first place. And that's the kind of underlying base note of the book all the way through, and of War on Want. So neoliberalism has made things particularly stark in terms of inequality and poverty. In a sense, it's forced the issues onto the agenda in a way which I don't think was the case under social democracy, even though the issues were there. But one of the things hinted at in the book, it's only hinted at, but I want to draw it out because I agree with it very strongly, is that actually the neoliberal offensive from the 70s onwards, when social democracy was said to be breaking down, I think it was actually actively undermined, but the language of retrospective narrative is that it fell apart of its own, somehow, its own accord. Margaret Thatcher rode to the rescue to solve the problems of social democracy. My argument would be that actually neoliberalism was a very deliberate, sounds too conspiratorial, but it was an active intervention to undermine social democracy precisely because the redistribution, moderate though it was, that had been achieved over that period in the global north was too much for capital to bear. And that was a redistribution both in simple economic terms. The share of labour got too high and the share of capital was getting, for them, dangerously low, though it was still grotesquely unequal. It was also the case in terms of the globalisation of particular sectors. Your middle sector, the clothing industry, as I call it, not garments, very American, the clothing industry was globalised from the 60s onwards, 50s, 60s onwards, precisely as, in part, precisely as a way of escaping the gains that had been made by northern labour, undermining the strength of northern labour and taking advantage of potential weaknesses and cheapnesses of labour in the south. So, and there was also the question of power. There is no doubt that at that period, capital and elites thought that there was now too big a voice. We wouldn't think it so, but there was too big a voice for labour, social democratic discourses, ideas of equality, and so forth. So neoliberalism isn't some kind of accidental exacerbation of inequality in terms of economics, income, poverty, power, democracy. That was its point, in a sense, to redress the balance after what we would see as the marginal successes of social democracy. Now, to me, and now I'm going to have some difficulties, to me that means, yes, we must have like I need a piano, you know, we're going to play the piano, somebody turns the pages for you. Thank you very much. That means, yes, seize this moment, we need a specific and particularly aggressive attack on inequality at this moment, because neoliberalism has put it on the agenda and it's massively important, it's real, and we must attack it. But secondly, it means we can't go back to social democracy. We can't seek the solutions within those structures, which basically retained a market system of production, which produced inequality, and then said, oops, now we've got to have a state which goes in for redistribution. I mean, it's a bonkers kind of way of running an economy anyway. First you produce a problem, and then you try and solve it. So, and what we know now, looking back, is that they would only let redistribution anyway go that far. So we can't go back to that model. And I think the third thing that historical understanding, which you hint at in the book, and I agree with so much, implies is that there is, I know there are lots of complexities and contradictions of interest and conflicts of interest between peoples in poverty in the north and the south, but their causes are linked. And one of the things we can most constructively do is precisely build the narratives which show those links in order to construct relations between, you know, help construct relations between groups in the different parts of the world. So the book's argument runs very, very deep to argue then that these causes are structural, as John said, and they cannot be fundamentally addressed by policies which are essentially only ameliorative and redistributional. They have to be structural. And those structures are certainly economic. We are talking here mode of production and market relations and stuff like that, but they are also political. One of the things which I don't think you mentioned so much now, but which runs through the book, and I'm sure Francisco will talk about it, I found in Latin America, one of the most important things has been the way in which the accumulation of power into capital has absolutely eviscerated democracy. And the way in which this inequality now is about voice. It's about political voice and political interest. In the end, then, at the broader level, what's at issue is a question of power in its broadest sense and class, not to put too fine a point on it. So that's the first thing. This thing is a big structural phenomenon, and it runs deep. The second thing I want to say is that I'd read parts of the book before, when John was writing it, but when I sat down and read the thing from beginning to end, Chapter 2 for a start, I mean, it's all brilliant, but the chapters on things like trade agreements, these bilateral investment treaties, BITs they're called, the stuff on the legal offences that have been taken against states and communities for doing the most minor things but infringing upon the toes of some global corporation somewhere. The stuff on the absolutely horrendous effects of philanthropic capitalism. I mean, I never did like Bill Gates. After reading this chapter, I was even more annoyed. It's not just that it's not the way to do it, but that it has absolutely negative effects, that kind of privatised way of intervening in what are often, in his terms, romanticised ways of looking at poverty and looking at the difficulties of people around the world. the stuff that you have on corporate social responsibility. Not, again, just that it's a smokescreen, but that it's an active mechanism for the further invasion of capital into other areas, both geographical areas and areas of particular societies and economies. And I could go on. I mean, there's the stuff that John mentioned about other NGOs and their increasingly collaborationist turn, if you like, being in various ways inveigled into working with the powers which are on the opposite side. And once you're in that kind of embrace, how difficult it is to maintain the politics and the policies, which I believe quite a lot of them still believe in, but you get sucked in and you lose it. So reading that chapter, and those chapters actually, 2, 3, and even to a kind of seasoned old critic, cynic like me, it took me back actually, and it absolutely enraged me. I mean, some of the individual stories I didn't know, like the way Argentina was targeted over and over again after the crash in Argentina, and some of the policy initiatives and some of the things that had happened as a result of trying to get out of that. Companies come in and say, oh, we claim compensation because we suffered. I mean, absolutely extraordinary stuff. So read it, just if you want to feel like getting mad. Certainly read that. And I don't. The second thing that made me think about was, I'm a social scientist, Hilary said, and I don't know whether you are here, but in the social sciences there's this postmodern turn, not all of which I hate, but there is a tendency to absolutely deny the existence of any big story. And a big story is not the same as a grand narrative. It's a big story is just that big things are happening. There's no teleology here, there's no essential end point or anything like that. But they reduce everything to individual negotiations, to tentative, hesitant, all the language that is constantly used. Read these chapters. Tell anybody you know that indulges in this language, read these chapters. This is not tentative, this is not hesitant, this is not dispersed. It's horrifyingly, it's an elite, it's a class, solidarity, complicity, and, given the lack of democracy, total impunity. And we are living with that now. Most people don't even know it's happening. And we think I thought I was informed and I learned more. And most people aren't aware at all. So there's a solid network of mutually supportive, mutually reinforcing elites and interests. And it's very hard to address, partly because of the effects on democracy and the immunity that they have from any kind of scrutiny, given the way in which governments, including some in the Global South, the media and so forth, are recruited into the discourse. And the discourse point is really important. I think you mentioned it once, but I think it's massively important. The control over the structuring of the discourse through which we talk about these global issues. I mean, if you read some of the individual stories, for instance, about a company going to say to a community, to a government, that policy did us harm, therefore we must have compensation. The logic that is in there is absolutely extraordinary. And in the current mindset that we exist in, it's an irrefutable logic, because it's all about it's a logic of markets, it's a logic of commercial transactions, it's a logic of individual ownership, it's a logic where companies are, as you say, individual legal entities. And if we don't challenge things at that level, we don't stand a chance. So, I mean, I think that is a point that you would be very strongly making. But as John said, he's throughout the book, he's drawn upon alternatives, both and this is a geographical issue which I think is very interesting, both grassroots levels and levels of state level intervention. And one of the questions which I think is being addressed in Latin America, which we've hardly begun to think about in Europe, is how you articulate social movements and states, progressive states, in common struggles. And that is really very important. A couple more things on that. I mean, although it's dispiriting, I do think that the stories that John tells in those chapters point to a whole load of different forms of potential pressure and outrage. It's like UK Uncut. There could be a kind of UK Uncut at a whole range of points in all this horrendous network that they have, of solidarity that they have constructed. And to think about ways in which they could be put together, I think, would be very interesting. And maybe also some kinds of counterintuitive campaigns. Let's have a campaign against philanthropy. You know, I mean, I've long wanted to have a campaign against social mobility. I mean, I want to abolish class seats, not have people climb up and down them. So, I mean, I think something counterintuitive is often quite good, you know. So there's a lot, if you reread those chapters, I think there's a lot of, I don't know, kind of points, pressure points and potential for getting together that might come out.
It's a book that understands the imperfections of what people are trying to do, and understand this as movement. That is to say, people are addressing extremely difficult issues which are the result of centuries of exploitation, distortion, expoliation, pillage, and so on. And therefore they have to operate with whatever they have at hand at the time. Inevitably, therefore, there will be complexities, which is a way out of not answering some of the points. But that's what I like about it, is the very positive perception of Latin America in understanding these, you know, overall difficulties. I like it a lot. The reason I'm saying this is because of this. I'm not sure how true this is in general for every book, but I'm accustomed to getting books that tell us what to do. You're not doing it right. You're not organizing working controls that much. How about, you know, nationalizing without compensation or with less compensation or whatever it is, which is possible as an argument, as a discussion, but people on the ground, I think, know much better what they're doing. So it is a book written with sympathy for what is taking place over there, which is changing the world. And in that sense, it sees one world as fighting, resisting against the same extremely powerful enemies. So let me move very briefly to Latin America, which is a big continent, and I'll have to compact a great deal. It is right. Neoliberalism doesn't just happen. It is engineered. I know this so well. Neoliberalism is claimed to have started here in Britain when people voted the wrong way in 1979. And then even worse in the United States in 1984, somebody called Ronnie. But actually it's not true. It began in Chile in 1973. And it was so brutal. In other words, democracy had to be destroyed totally, comprehensively, and brutally and fulminatingly, that's a lot of adverbs there, in order for them to implement exactly what they wanted. Let me be very graphic about this. The coup in Chile began at 5 o'clock in the morning. Chilean democracy was totally dead, including our president, by 3 p.m. There was no opposition of any kind whatsoever. And they proceeded to do what we know they have done. The levels of exploitation, the level of abuse, the level of imposition, the way the sovereignty of the country was sold out, the wave of privatization and the horrible consequences on the population were a model. And sometimes it makes you sick when they privatized everything they could. I always make this point: had they been able to privatize or have had the technology to privatize air, they would have done it. Possibly they would have resolved the problem of poverty if they had been able to do this, if you see what I mean. And they privatized, you know, people's lives of work. What I mean by this is when you work for 40 years and you get a pension and this is privatized and is put in the market in the most risky and vulnerable adventures, and people's lives go to waste. 40 years, 45 years, 30 years, 35 years. And when you see people like Frank Field, I must mention him, saying that he wants to adopt for Britain the pension system of Pinochet, which he admires, makes you really worried that somehow either people don't understand or understand too much, and therefore they're not on the right side of the equation. If you look at the brutality with which neoliberalism was imposed in Latin America, it's absolutely horrific. 10,000 people assassinated in Chile, 30,000 people assassinated in Argentina, 50,000 people assassinated in Nicaragua, 60,000 in Peru, 80,000 in El Salvador, 120,000 in Guatemala. These are the figures on which neoliberalism was actually developed in Latin America. Democracy was inimical to neoliberalism, and they impoverished us on top of that massively. In 1990, according to the Economic Commission of Latin America, the level of poverty in the region as a whole was 48%. That's a massive, gigantic. And we have to endure this for 30 years. This was not 1 year or 5 years or 18 years of Tory party, which are very bad. But this is 30 years of consistent, systematic impoverishment, brutality, persecution. You know, good people ended up in London, if you see what I mean. And we would like to have been there doing something else. But here we are. So it is extraordinary. I think it fits, it links up with the message of the book. There is an alternative. I'm not going to quote Obama, but it can be done. Yes, we can. And we can say that in Latin America it can be done. I remember the despondency vividly, because the coup took place in 73, and I managed to stay there alive until 79, doing something against the military. And I remember vividly the despondency, the demoralization, the desperation, the despair, the total destruction of individuals' psychological commitment to everything, or to anything. Because, you know, they couldn't see any way out. And many of them believed that the model would be Spain, 40 years, 38 years. And some of them, I remember vividly, told me, I'm this many years old, 40 years, and, you know, I'm not going to stay there. I'm not going to continue doing what I'm doing. I'm sorry, I'm giving up. And around you all the time, not only those who were falling because they were killed, assassinated, tortured, imprisoned, and so on, but there were all those who actually gave up. You're shrunk to a very small minority. And I always wonder, as a magical thing, you know, magical realism is something I think we invented and we produce every day. Look at it. We started to get rid of governments, one after another. Social movements were gigantic. And this is an issue I think it's interesting to develop in the book, possibly in the second version of Luke Press is going to ask you to do. They found ways, have found ways over there which are very creative, very imaginative to organize politically. If you think of the MAS in Bolivia, the MAS is a movement of movements. They have masses of movements all over the country, and they come together in some sort of event, coalition, they link up, they understand, they negotiate, they put forward, they summarize, they formulate, and that it is, and look at where they are. They are changing completely Bolivian society for good. The very fact that the person who is leading the country is an indigenous person, an Aymara, whose Spanish is not as good as his Aymara because it's his second language, is an indication. He never went to university. In fact, Lula never went to university. Chavez never went to university. Many others didn't go to university. So in Latin America, if you want to be a president, don't go to the university. And it is this creativity and imagination to be able to actually operate with what they have. And therefore, and I don't have the answer, but I certainly have the question, how can you put together these wonderful, very vigorous movements in Europe and in the advanced countries, and also elsewhere? How can you put them together in order to produce political change, not just resistance, not just forcing concessions, even militantly, even genuine ones? The question is, how do you ensure that this is entrenched over the long period? And this is what I think we are managing to do so far. I would say so far so good. And you cannot avoid the question of politics. And exactly how do you put these together into some sort of political form? Because we know that we're able to do what we're able to do because we have state power, or at least government power. And we have developed that quite massively, you know, in some countries more than others. So it's very interesting that the sovereignty, the recovery of the national resources, the redistribution of income, the eradication of poverty, the creation of a fairer society is absolutely central to all of these is the development of democracy. We couldn't do it without democracy. And if you look at what you say in your book regarding the operation of the corporate social responsibility, I nearly felt sick when I didn't realize how bad it was. I thought it was something nice, but it's much worse than I imagined. When you have these two things, you know, how you actually are able to put this together and turn into a political party, into some sort of government power. And when you look in Europe and you think, Jesus Christ, you know, Berlusconi, you know, it's quite problematical. Nevertheless, the message is this: given what we're able to do, and I know we're very different, and what is going on there is fantastic, it's under threat, but we will continue pushing for that. We are recovering our dignity. We are looking to our past in order to use the historic iconic figures that our societies have produced in order to build the future that we need. And we're doing that in the present. So it can be done. I'm sure you can do much better than we can. So my point is this: however difficult it is, do not believe the capitalists, believe people like John and his book, and never, ever give up. Thank you.